Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a fascinating and honestly completely misunderstood social hierarchy hidden right behind the music of the Middle Ages. We tend to lump all medieval musicians together, but the real truth is a story of strict class divisions, aristocratic boredom, and, believe it or not, the very invention of modern romance. Now, if you play fantasy role-playing games or just consume a lot of modern pop culture, you've probably seen these terms treated as totally interchangeable synonyms. A minstrel, a bard, a troubadour. They all just kind of conjure up this image of a wandering vagabond strumming a lute in a smoky tavern, right? Well, historically, treating these words as synonyms couldn't be further from the truth. They actually represented a rigid and fiercely protected class divide. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1, the medieval musician myth; 2, minstrels, the working class; 3, bards, keepers of tradition; 4, troubadours, the noble composers; and finally, 5, the legacy of courtly love.
So jumping right into section 1, the medieval musician myth, pop culture versus historical reality.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is a brilliant modern music metaphor I found from a Guild Wars 2 fan discussion. It absolutely nails the historical class divide we're talking about today. Think of it like this. If a minstrel is a pop singer, working for the masses, and a bard is a folk singer, preserving cultural history, then a troubadour is an opera singer, high society, educated, and elite. You wouldn't expect an opera singer to be begging for coin to the local pub, and you wouldn't expect a troubadour to be doing that either. Moving down the ladder to section 2, minstrels, the working class, singing for supper in the Middle Ages. The etymology here actually tells you everything you need to know about their social standing. The word minstrel comes from the French, but it ultimately derives from the Latin word minister, which meant a minor official or a household servant. And this is in direct, sharp contrast to a magister, or a major superior official. Minstrels were essentially gig workers. They traveled around singing simple songs and telling stories in exchange for basic meals and a little bit of coin. Within this lower tier, you had professional entertainers often known as jongleurs or jogglers. They functioned very much like a lively local pub band today. Their job was to make the masses merry, generate a few laughs, and provide some loose, accessible entertainment. They weren't up there performing complex artistic masterpieces. They were literally just playing simple, catchy tunes for everyday folks. Which brings us to section 3, bards, keepers of tradition. Epic tales for the masses. So bards were a totally different breed. They were not just entertainers. They were the absolutely vital keepers of oral tradition. You have to remember, in a time when the vast majority of the public was completely illiterate, the common person couldn't just go pick up a book to learn about their history. Instead, they listened to bards. Often of Celtic origin, bards served as living history books, regaling crowds with epic, heroic poetry about great battles and notable feats. And unlike the minstrels, bards relied primarily on their voices. They used very minimal, simple instrumentation, if they used any at all. Now we climb to the very top for section 4, troubadours, the noble composers, high society and high art. So the crucial point to understand here is the stark class division between invention and performance. The word troubadour comes from the Occitan word trobar, which literally means to find or to invent. Troubadours, like the famous Duke of Aquitaine, were often of noble birth. They composed this complex, highly lyrical and formulaic art. But there's a deep irony here. They didn't necessarily perform it themselves. No way. These wealthy elites would actually hire those working-class joggers we talked about earlier to do all the heavy lifting and publicly perform the music that the nobles had invented. And hey, we absolutely cannot talk about troubadours without talking about the trouvères. These were noble female composers active in southern France, and it is a truly incredible historical exception. Medieval society was, across the board, brutally male-dominated. Yet these noble women stand out in musical history as the first known female composers of Western secular music. Because so many men were away fighting in the Crusades, and because southern French society actually allowed women more control over land, these women held significant power and contributed immensely to courtly art. Just as a quick aside, before we move on, it's worth noting a slight regional divide here. In the south of France, where they spoke Occitan, you had the troubadours, singing their complex, lyrical harmonies about love. But up in northern France, the aristocracy had their own exact equivalent, known as trouvères, who composed their work in the northern dialects. And that leads us perfectly into section 5, the legacy of courtly love, how aristocratic boredom birthed romance. Let's look at the timeline to see how this builds across the High Middle Ages. Starting right around the year 1000, Europe experienced a massive economic and population boom. For a few hundred years, the nobility enjoyed an era of extreme cultural opulence and, frankly, a massive amount of free time. This leisure is exactly what enabled the troubadour tradition to emerge and peak, reigning supreme right up until the devastation of the Black Death in 1348. So how exactly did this all lead to the concept of chivalry? Well, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was a wildly powerful noblewoman from the south, married into the French monarchy and moved her court north to Paris. And she brought her troubadours and their love songs right along with her. Up in Paris, these southern songs of romance crashed headfirst into the northern culture, which was obsessed with military valor and epic poetry of battle. The result of this collision was a massive cultural merger. Suddenly, knights were being depicted undertaking quests, not just for military glory, but for the love of a lady. They intertwined martial valor with romantic aspiration. You really have to picture the scene back in Aquitaine that started all of this. Imagine a laid-back court filled with young, single, highly educated knights who had a lot of free time and, honestly, raging hormones, mostly because they weren't off at war. But because of the strict system of arranged marriages, the only women around were married noblewomen. So these bored knights started writing songs of unrequited love, just longing from a distance. Interestingly, they inverted the medieval social order in their music. While legally a woman was completely subservient to her husband, in troubadour songs, the male knight became a willing slave to the desires and whims of his noble lady, constantly having to prove his worth through bravery and quests. And this brilliantly illustrates their massive cultural impact. Just look at this quote. If you want to look for the origins of Western romantic literature, from Shakespeare's sonnets to modern Harlequin romance novels, it really begins right here in Aquitaine with the Troubadours. This elite, highly privileged class of composers didn't just pass the time, they completely revolutionized Western literature. The entire way we think about love, the very concept of trying to win someone's heart by being a better, more noble person, that all traces directly back to the lyrical games played by the troubadours in the aristocratic courts of France. Which leaves us with this final, really fascinating thought to consider. We generally think of romance as this universal, timeless human experience, right? But looking at the rigid class divide of medieval musicians, we have to ask ourselves, is our modern concept of true love actually just a byproduct of medieval class privilege, arranged marriages, and aristocratic boredom? It definitely makes you rethink every love song you hear on the radio today, doesn't it? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning what you think you know.